A Christmas letter. I can still feel the cold December air biting at my skin as if it were yesterday. Though what chilled me most wasn't the weather, it was what I found. The house was quiet, decorated with soft, twinkling lights and the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree we had picked out together. It felt like the kind of scene you'd find on the front of a holiday card. But beneath the surface of that picture-perfect moment, everything was about to fall apart. It happened when I was looking for wrapping paper in his study. I'd forgotten where I'd stored the extra rolls and figured he might have tucked them away in one of his drawers. The desk was as pristine as ever, with its neatly stacked papers, perfectly aligned pens, and the faint whiff of his cologne lingering in the air. I wasn't snooping, I swear I wasn't. But the letter caught my eye when I opened the bottom drawer. It was sitting there, slightly crumpled, as if it had been read 100 times. My heart started to race, the kind of nervous flutter you feel when you know you're about to do something you might regret. I unfolded the paper, my fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. Dear Sabina, this year has been special because of you. I froze. Who was Sabina? My name isn't Sabina. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a work letter? A draft for a client? But as I read on, the pit in my stomach deepened. Your laughter has been the highlight of my days. The way you make even the simplest moments feel extraordinary is a gift I never knew I needed. Thank you for being you. I can't wait to see what the new year holds for us. With love, Ryan. The paper slipped from my fingers, falling to the desk like a dead weight. My Ryan. My husband. My partner. Writing Thisto someone else. I sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the letter as if it might explain itself if I just looked hard enough. How long had this been going on? Who was she? Why hadn't I noticed? 1,000 questions bombarded me at once, each one sharper than the last. My chest tightened and tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to cry. Not yet. After what felt like an eternity, I picked up the letter and read it again. Every word felt like a dagger, each one driving home the reality of what was happening. And yet, amidst the hurt and betrayal, a small defiant voice inside me began to rise. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to understand the extent of this betrayal before I handed him the satisfaction of my outrage. Instead, an idea began to form, a way to turn his deceit back on him, if only for a moment. I grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and sat down at the desk. My hand trembled as I began to write, carefully mimicking his handwriting. The words poured out bitter and sharp. Dear Ryan, thank you for sharing your heart this Christmas. I had no idea how skilled you were at splitting it into pieces. Perhaps before you make any new resolutions for the coming year, you might want to reconsider your current ones. Yours always, the woman who thought she was enough. I read it over twice, tweaking a few words until it felt perfect, calm, cutting, and just ambiguous enough to make him squirm. Folding it neatly, I placed it in a clean envelope and sealed it. I wrote his name on the front in my best cursive, just as he had done for her, and left it on his desk. Then I waited. Ryan came home late that night, his cheeks red from the cold and his arms laden with grocery bags. He kissed me on the cheek, his smile warm and unsuspecting. Hey love. How was your day? I smiled back, my face an impeccable mask. Uneventful, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. You? Busy as always, he replied, moving toward the kitchen. I followed him, watching him unpack ingredients for what he called his Christmas Eve surprise. The man was practically glowing with cheer, humming softly under his breath as if he didn't have a care in the world. It was infuriating. The letter stayed on his desk for 2 days. I kept my distance, pretending not to notice whether he'd opened it or not. But on the morning of Christmas Eve, I found him in the study, staring at the paper with a look that was equal parts confusion and dread. His hands were gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Ryan, I said, feigning innocence as I leaned against the doorway. Everything okay? He looked up sharply, his face pale. Yeah, everything's fine. Oh, I said, tilting my head. You look like you've seen a ghost. His eyes darted back to the letter, and for a moment I thought he might confess. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the calculations as he tried to figure out how much I knew. But instead he simply smiled, a weak, forced thing. Just tired, that's all. I nodded, holding his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. All right. Don't stay in here too long. Dinner's almost ready. He nodded and I left, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what would come next, whether he would come clean or bury the truth even deeper. But for the first time in days I felt a strange sense of power. He had broken my trust, shattered my heart, but at least now he knew I wasn't blind. Whatever his next move was, I'd be ready. The rest of Christmas Eve passed in an eerie sort of limbo, with Ryan's tension palpable despite his attempts to keep up appearances. He poured himself a second glass of wine at dinner, something he rarely did, and his laughter felt forced, as if he were trying too hard to convince me, and perhaps himself, that everything was normal. I, on the other hand, wore the mask of a perfect wife, smiling, chatting, and pretending not to notice the way his hands fidgeted or how his eyes darted toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. That night, as we climbed into bed, I wondered if he'd say anything. Confession? A slip of the tongue? An attempt at damage control? But Ryan simply kissed me goodnight and turned off his bedside lamp. I lay awake long after his breathing evened out, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the situation pressed down on me. The letter wasn't enough. I wanted answers. I deserved answers. But how far was I willing to go to get them? The next morning, Christmas Day, came wrapped in its usual trappings of joy and tradition. We exchanged gifts by the tree, sipping coffee as soft holiday music played in the background. He gave me a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a tiny charm that sparkled in the morning light. For my beautiful wife, he said, slipping it around my neck. I forced a smile, hating how much I wanted to believe in this moment. How easy it would have been to pretend nothing had happened, to sink back into the comfort of ignorance. But every time I looked at him, I saw the words of that letter etched across his face, like an invisible scar that only I could see. I waited until after breakfast to make my move. Ryan had gone outside to clear the driveway, his boots crunching in the snow, and I used the opportunity to slip back into his study. The drawer where I'd found the letter was empty now. But I wasn't looking for the original. I was looking for clues. Anything that might lead me to Sabina. I searched methodically, careful not to disturb anything that would give away my presence. His phone bill yielded nothing unusual, nor did his calendar. I was about to give up when I spotted his laptop, slightly ajar on the desk. I hesitated. Snooping through his computer felt like crossing a line, even after everything. But hadn't he crossed it first? I opened the lid and typed in his password, our anniversary. My stomach twisted at the irony when it worked. His email inbox was a goldmine. It didn't take long to find her name, Sabina. There were dozens of emails, some mundane and work-related, others much more personal. My hands shook as I clicked through them, each one a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. They'd met at a conference last spring, exchanged numbers, and what began as casual banter had grown into something much deeper. Their messages were filled with inside jokes, shared memories, and declarations of affection that made my stomach churn. She wasn't just some fling. She was important to him. One email in particular caught my eye. It was dated just a week ago, titled Our Plans. My heart pounded as I opened it. Ian. I can't stop thinking about next week. Spending New Year's Eve with you feels like the perfect way to start the year. I've booked the room at the inn, same place as last time. Can't wait to see you. Love, Sabina. The room spun. New Year's Eve. While I'd been planning a quiet evening at home, dreaming about resolutions and shared hopes for the future, he'd been planning to sneak away with her. I clenched my fists, anger rising like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. This was betrayal on a level I couldn't ignore. I snapped a photo of the email with my phone, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. Closing the laptop, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the desk as a million thoughts raced through my mind. What was I going to do? Confront him? Call her? Burn the inn to the ground? None of it felt like enough. None of it could erase the pain or undo what he'd done. By the time Ryan came back inside, I had regained my composure. He greeted me with a smile, shaking snow from his hair, and I smiled back, wondering how he could look so normal. How he could lie so effortlessly. I spent the rest of the day pretending, going through the motions of Christmas while my mind raced with plans. That night, after Ryan had fallen asleep, I sent an email to Sabina from his account. I kept it short, simple, and designed to set the stage. Sabina, something's come up. I need to talk to you before we move forward with our plans. Can we meet tomorrow? Usual place. Ryan. I didn't know if she'd respond, but part of me didn't care. It wasn't about her, it was about him. About seeing how far he'd go to maintain this facade, how much of himself he'd give to protect his lie. When morning came, her reply was waiting in his inbox. Of course. Same time as last time. I almost laughed at the audacity of it all. The secrecy, the codes, the ease with which they orchestrated their betrayal. I sent a quick reply confirming the time, then closed his laptop and went about my day biding my time. When the appointed hour arrived, I followed him. He left the house casually, his excuse about a last-minute errand so flimsy it would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. I stayed a few cars behind as he drove into town, my heart pounding with every turn. When he pulled into the parking lot of a small, charming inn, I felt a strange mixture of fury and vindication. He hadn't even tried to hide it. I parked at a distance and waited, watching as he disappeared inside. It would have been easy to storm in after him, to confront them both in a blaze of righteous anger. But that wasn't what I wanted. Not yet. Instead, I sat there letting the weight of the moment sink in, and for the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to cry. The tears came in slow, silent waves, soaking into the collar of my coat as I sat in the car, the engine idling softly beneath me. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, though that was a pain sharper than I had ever known. It was the sheer absurdity of it all. The cruel irony of being blindsided in what was supposed to be the happiest, most magical time of the year. Christmas lights twinkled on lampposts around the inn, their glow mocking me with their cheerfulness. Somewhere inside that building my husband was with her, playing out the fantasy they had so carefully crafted behind my back. I could almost see it in my mind. The stolen glances, the whispered words, the way he would probably touch her arm, her face, gestures that once belonged to me alone. But I didn't move. Couldn't, not yet. My mind was a swirling storm of emotions, grief, rage, humiliation, but beneath it all was something colder, harder, resolve. I didn't just want him to pay. I wanted him to understand, to feel the weight of what he'd done, to live in the wreckage he had created. Minutes turned into an hour, then longer. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I finally saw him emerge, her by his side. Sabina. She was younger than I'd imagined, maybe in her early 30s with sleek dark hair and a confident stride. She laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm as they walked toward his car. My stomach twisted at the sight, bile rising in my throat. He opened the passenger door for her, ever the gentleman, before circling around to the driver's side. I ducked low in my seat as they drove off, letting them gain a comfortable distance before I followed. They didn't go far. A quiet little restaurant on the edge of town, tucked away in a grove of snow-dusted trees. The kind of place that promised privacy for those who needed it. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched as they walked inside together, disappearing into the warmth and golden glow of the dining room. For a moment I considered barging in, demanding answers in front of a room full of strangers. The thought was tempting, but it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't just want to confront him. I wanted to unravel him piece by piece the way he had unraveled me. And so, instead of stepping into the restaurant, I pulled out my phone and began typing. My message to Ryan was simple. I hope dinner is worth it. Merry Christmas. I hit send and waited, my pulse thundering in my ears. Less than a minute later, I saw him check his phone through the window. His reaction was immediate. He stiffened, his face paling as his eyes scanned the room, as if expecting to see me standing there. Sabina said something to him, her expression curious, but he shook his head, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I could tell he was trying to play it cool, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. He was nervous. Good. I sent another message, this one more direct. You should have picked a better hiding spot. I'm closer than you think. This time his reaction was more pronounced. He excused himself from the table, his movements jerky, and stepped outside. I slid lower in my seat as he scanned the parking lot, his breath visible in the frigid air. He paced for a moment, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, before dialing a number. My phone buzzed almost instantly, his name lighting up the screen. I didn't answer. Let him stew. A part of me wanted to make him suffer longer, but the truth was I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The adrenaline that had been fueling me all day was starting to wear off, leaving behind a hollow ache that threatened to consume me. I needed to end this one way or another. Stepping out of the car, I zipped up my coat and walked across the street, my boots crunching in the snow. Ryan didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in scanning his phone, probably rereading my messages in a desperate attempt to figure out what was going on. When I was just a few feet away, I cleared my throat. Looking for someone? He spun around, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Emily, he finally managed, his voice cracking. What are you doing here? I crossed my arms, tilting my head as I studied him. I could ask you the same thing. But I think we both know the answer to that, don't we? He glanced around nervously, as if hoping no one else was within earshot. This isn't what it looks like, he began, his tone frantic. I can explain. Save it, I snapped, cutting him off. I've seen the emails, Ryan. I've read the letter. I know everything. His face went pale, all the color draining from his cheeks as the weight of my words sank in. Emily, please, he said, stepping closer. Don't, I said sharply, taking a step back. Don't you dare try to justify this. Not here, not now. He stopped, his hands falling limply to his sides. For the first time since I'd found that letter, he looked truly defeated. But I wasn't done. I wasn't even close. Do you have any idea what it's like? I asked, my voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. To find out that the person you've built your life with, the person you've trusted with everything, has been lying to you? To sit across from them at dinner, to sleep next to them at night, knowing they've given a piece of themselves to someone else. Emily, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. Stop, I said again, my voice breaking this time. Just stop. I turned away, swallowing the lump in my throat as tears threatened to spill over. You don't get to apologize, I said quietly. Not now. Not when the damage is already done. I didn't wait for his response. I walked away, my boots crunching against the snow as I headed back to my car. Behind me I could hear him calling my name, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face what came next. Not yet. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I glanced back at the restaurant one last time. Through the window, I could see Sabina sitting at their table, her expression puzzled as she waited for him to return. It struck me then how little she mattered in all of this. She wasn't the one who had betrayed me. That was all him. And now it was up to me to decide what to do with the pieces of my shattered life. The drive home was a blur, the quiet hum of the engine doing little to drown out the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. Each passing streetlight illuminated the darkened interior of the car, casting fleeting shadows that felt almost alive, mirroring the chaos within me. I replayed the events of the day over and over, the weight of them pressing down on my chest like a vice. The confrontation outside the restaurant had given me a fleeting sense of power, a moment of vindication, but it hadn't brought the closure I craved. If anything, it had left me more unsettled. The enormity of the situation now laid bare. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed ahead like a ghost, its twinkling Christmas lights suddenly garish and cruel. What was once a symbol of warmth and togetherness now felt like a mockery, a hollow facade masking the emptiness inside. I sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to summon the strength to go inside. The thought of facing the silence, the memories, was almost too much to bear. Eventually, I forced myself to move, stepping out into the cold night air. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the door, my breath visible in the icy glow of the porch light. Inside, the house was still and quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. I shrugged off my coat and hung it on the rack, the mundane action feeling almost surreal in the wake of everything that had happened. I wandered into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine with trembling hands. The first sip burned its way down my throat, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I carried the glass to the couch, sinking into its familiar embrace as I stared at the Christmas tree. The lights blinked softly, their rhythm steady and unchanging, as if the world hadn't just imploded around me. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my daze. I picked it up reluctantly, my stomach twisting when I saw Ryan's name on the screen. The message was brief. "Please let me come home so we can talk." I set the phone down without replying, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Talk. What was there to talk about? He'd made his choices, and now we were both living with the consequences. But even as I thought it, a part of me ached for answers. For clarity. For anything that would make sense of this mess. The hours crept by in a haze, the wine doing little to dull the sharp edges of my thoughts. It was well past midnight when I finally heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart lurched painfully, and I set my glass down, bracing myself as the front door opened. Ryan stepped inside, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on them. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes searching mine. "Emily," he said softly, his voice tinged with desperation. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now, but please just let me explain." I didn't say anything, didn't move from the couch. He took that as permission, closing the door quietly behind him before walking toward me. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice trembling. I messed up. I know that. I betrayed you in the worst way possible, and I hate myself for it." I crossed my arms, my gaze fixed on him. "Why?" I asked, my voice sharp and cutting. "Why her? Why now?" He flinched at the question, his shoulders sagging as he looked away. "It wasn't about you," he said finally, his tone laced with regret. "It was never about you. It was me. I don't know. I felt stuck, like I was just going through the motions. And then she came along and it was exciting and—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice cold. "Do not stand there and try to justify this by blaming some midlife crisis or whatever excuse you think will make this easier for me to swallow. You made a choice, Ryan. You didn't just trip and fall into her bed." He winced at the harshness of my words, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. And I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life. But Emily, I love you. I always have. I just— love." I scoffed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You don't do this to someone you love. You don't lie to them, betray them, humiliate them. Whatever you felt for me, it wasn't love. Not anymore." He took a step closer, his expression pleading. "I can't lose you," he whispered. "Please, tell me what I can do to fix this." I stared at him, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to hurl every ounce of anger and pain I felt in his face. But another part of me, the part that had spent years building a life with him, was tempted by his words. Tempted to believe that we could fix this, that there was still something worth saving. "I don't know if you can," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I want you to." His face crumpled at my words, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in his eyes. He sank into the armchair across from me, burying his face in his hands. The sight of him like that, broken and vulnerable, stirred something in me, though I wasn't sure if it was pity or anger. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy in the air. I thought about all the Christmases we'd spent together, the laughter and love that had once defined us. And I wondered if it was possible to find our way back to that place, or if it was too late. When Ryan finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen, he said the only thing that made sense. "I'll do whatever it takes, Emily. But if you need me to go, I will. Just tell me what you need." I didn't answer right away, because the truth was I didn't know what I needed, or if anything he could offer would ever be enough. The silence between us stretched on, thick and suffocating, as I wrestled with the storm of emotions churning inside me. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. They all fought for dominance, leaving me exhausted and hollow. Ryan sat across from me, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as though he were trying to anchor himself, his eyes searching mine for any sign of forgiveness. But I couldn't give him that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I don't know what I need," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. What I do know is that you've broken something I don't think can be fixed. And honestly, I'm not sure I even want to try. Ryan flinched as though I'd slapped him, but I didn't let myself feel guilty. He deserved this. He deserved to feel the weight of what he'd done, to sit in the wreckage he'd caused. I stared at him, the man I had loved for so many years, and tried to reconcile the stranger sitting before me with the person I thought I knew. How had I missed it? How had I failed to see the cracks in our foundation until they split wide open? Emily, he said softly, his voice cracking. I know I can't undo what I've done, but please don't shut me out. Let me prove to you that I can be better. That I can be the man you deserve. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. The man I deserve? I repeated, shaking my head. Do you even hear yourself? You didn't care about being the man I deserved when you were sneaking around with her. When you were lying to my face day after day. So why now, Ryan? Why is it only now that you're suddenly desperate to fix this? He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. No, I said firmly. I don't want to hear your excuses or your promises. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a moment, I thought he might leave, that he'd finally give me the space I so desperately needed. But instead he looked back up, his eyes filled with a determination that made my chest ache. You're right, he said. I've lied. I've betrayed you. And there's nothing I can say to make that okay. But I love you, Emily. I love you more than anything in this world. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if you'll let me. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Once they would have been enough. Once I would have clung to them, let them soothe the ache in my chest, and lull me into a fragile sense of security. But now they felt hollow, empty. Words weren't enough anymore. I don't know if I can believe you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'll ever be able to believe you again. Ryan's face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. But he held himself together, his jaw tightening as he nodded slowly. I understand, he said. And I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Even if it takes the rest of my life. I wanted to scream at him. To tell him that trust wasn't something he could just earn back like a lost wallet. It wasn't a matter of effort or time. It was a delicate, fragile thing. And once it was shattered, it could never be made whole again. But I didn't have the energy for another fight. Not tonight. Go to bed, I said instead, my voice flat. We'll talk tomorrow. Ryan hesitated, as if he wanted to argue. But something in my expression must have stopped him. He nodded once, standing slowly, and making his way toward the stairs. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared from view. Only then did I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house felt unbearably quiet in his absence, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the glowing embers in the fireplace as my mind raced. Memories of happier times flooded my thoughts. The way he used to make me laugh, the way his arms felt around me, the countless little moments that had made up our life together. And yet, those memories now felt tainted, overshadowed by the knowledge of what he had done. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I stumbled upstairs to the guest room. I couldn't bear to sleep in our bed, not with the ghost of his betrayal lingering there. The sheets were cool against my skin as I curled up beneath them, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind refused to quiet, replaying the events of the past few days over and over again, until they blurred together in a haze of pain and confusion. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with fragments of what might have been, visions of a life where none of this had happened, where we were still the couple we used to be. But even in my dreams, the truth found its way in, turning those fleeting moments of happiness into bitter reminders of what I'd lost. Morning came too quickly, the pale light of dawn spilling through the curtains and dragging me back to reality. My body felt heavy, my chest tight with the weight of everything that still needed to be faced. I stayed in bed for as long as I could, dreading the moment I would have to see Ryan again, to confront the mess we were now left to untangle. Eventually, the smell of coffee wafted upstairs, and I forced myself to get up. I padded down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, and found Ryan in the kitchen. He looked tired, his hair mussed in dark circles under his eyes. But he greeted me with a small, tentative smile as I entered the room. "I made coffee," he said, holding out a mug. "I thought you might need it." I took the mug without a word, wrapping my hands around it as I leaned against the counter. The warmth seeped into my skin, but it did little to chase away the chill in my chest. Ryan watched me carefully, as if afraid to say the wrong thing, and for once, I appreciated his silence. We stood there for a long moment, the quiet between us heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. Finally, Ryan broke the silence, his voice low and hesitant. "I know you probably don't want to hear this," he said, "but I just need you to know that I'm not giving up. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Emily. Whatever it takes." I looked at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could find our way back to each other, that the love we once shared could survive this. But I wasn't sure if it was possible, or if I even wanted it to be. "Let's just take it one day at a time," I said finally, my voice weary. "I don't know what the future holds, Ryan, but right now I need space. I need time to figure out what I want." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Anything you need," he said. "I'll give you anything you need." I didn't respond, turning away as I sipped my coffee and stared out the window. Snow was falling gently outside, blanketing the world in a pristine layer of white. It was beautiful, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos in my heart. And as I stood there watching the world go on as if nothing had changed, I realized that I didn't have the answers, not yet. But for the first time I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I would find them someday. The days that followed were a strange, uneasy dance between us. Ryan did everything he could to keep his distance without completely vanishing, as if afraid that leaving me alone for too long would seal his fate. I couldn't bring myself to tell him to leave, though I knew that having him in the house only complicated everything. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. One moment I felt the urge to pack his bags and shove him out the door, and the next I found myself clinging to memories of the life we'd built together, wondering if there was anything left worth saving. I avoided the master bedroom, sleeping in the guest room instead, though I often caught Ryan lingering near the door, his face etched with guilt and longing. He never pushed, never tried to force his way in. He simply watched from a distance, like a man standing outside in the cold, waiting for a door that might never open. I couldn't decide if his patience made me feel better or worse. Every so often, I'd catch him doing something small, refilling my coffee cup without a word, folding the laundry I'd left in the dryer, shoveling the walkway before the snow could pile up. It was as if he were trying to prove his worth through these quiet acts of service, though I wasn't sure if they were meant for me or for his own conscience. And yet, I didn't stop him. Let him try. Let him grapple with the consequences of what he'd done. Meanwhile, I busied myself with anything and everything to avoid sitting still for too long. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, reorganizing closets, scrubbing floors, and tossing out anything that felt like it belonged to a life that no longer fit. The Christmas decorations came down earlier than usual, the twinkling lights and cheerful ornaments suddenly too painful to look at. Each box I packed felt like another piece of the holiday I'd lost, but I told myself it was better this way. Clean slate. Fresh start. It wasn't until New Year's Eve that I realized I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. The day passed in a blur, the weight of the date pressing down on me with every tick of the clock. I had no plans, no desire to celebrate. The thought of starting a new year felt absurd when I hadn't even begun to process the ruins of the old one. But as the evening crept closer, I knew I couldn't let the night slip by without addressing the unspoken tension that had filled the house. Ryan was in the living room when I found him, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Hope? Despair? I wasn't sure, and I wasn't ready to ask. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. He nodded, sitting up straighter as he gestured for me to join him. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him, leaving a careful distance between us. The space felt symbolic, a physical representation of the emotional chasm that had grown between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence thick with everything we'd been avoiding. "I don't know where to start," Ryan said finally, his voice rough. I've been trying to figure out the right words, the right way to fix this, but don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. This isn't about finding the perfect apology or saying what you think I want to hear. I just need the truth, Ryan. All of it. He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his hands. For a moment I thought he might try to deflect, but then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. You deserve that. And so, he began to tell me everything. How he'd met Sabina at a work conference last spring, how their conversations had started innocently enough before spiraling into something he hadn't expected, or so he claimed. He talked about the excitement, the escape, the way she made him feel like a different person. I listened in silence, my hands clenched tightly in my lap as I fought to keep my emotions in check. I don't know why I let it go so far, he admitted, his voice trembling. I knew it was wrong, but I was selfish. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it wouldn't change what we had, but that was a lie. It changed everything. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man I thought I'd married. Do you love her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. No, he said quickly. I thought I did for a moment. But it wasn't real. It was a fantasy. You're the one I love, Emily. You've always been the one. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But the wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too raw. If that's true, I said, my voice breaking, then why wasn't I enough? He looked at me then, his expression filled with a pain that mirrored my own. You are enough, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've always been enough. This wasn't about you. It was about me, my insecurities, my mistakes. And I'll hate myself for the rest of my life for making you feel otherwise. The sincerity in his voice was almost unbearable, and for a moment, I felt the smallest crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. But I wasn't ready to let it fall. Not yet. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know what the future looks like for us, Ryan. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. But right now I need time to figure out what I want. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. I'll wait as long as it takes. I stood then, unable to bear the weight of his gaze any longer. Happy New Year, Ryan, I said softly, the words heavy with sadness. He didn't respond and I didn't look back as I walked away. Upstairs, I climbed into the guest bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me as the distant sound of fireworks echoed through the night. A new year had begun, but for the first time it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like a question, one I wasn't ready to answer. The days after New Year's Eve passed in a strange limbo, each one blending into the next as I tried to make sense of the mess that had become my life. Ryan stayed in the house, quiet and careful, like a ghost haunting the edges of my existence. He gave me space as I'd asked, but his presence lingered, a constant reminder of the pain I was struggling to untangle. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into work, errands, and long walks through the snowy streets of our neighborhood. The cold air bit at my cheeks and numbed my hands, but I welcomed the sensation, the sharpness of it cutting through the fog in my mind. I needed clarity, and the stillness of winter seemed to offer it in fleeting moments, like slivers of light breaking through heavy clouds. One afternoon, while Ryan was out running errands, I found myself back in his study. The desk was immaculate, as always, the surface polished and bare except for his laptop and a framed photo of us from our honeymoon. I stared at the picture for a long moment, the memory it captured feeling like it belonged to someone else. We looked so happy, so full of promise, and the sight of it made my chest ache with longing for a version of us that no longer existed. I opened the laptop, my fingers hesitating over the keyboard before typing in his password. It still worked, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for this time. The emails with Sabina were gone, deleted no doubt, but part of me wondered if there was something else. Something I'd missed. As I scrolled through his inbox, a new email caught my eye. It was from Sabina, sent just a few days ago. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't open it, that whatever was inside would only hurt me more. But curiosity got the better of me. My hands trembled as I clicked on the message. Ryan, I know you've made your decision and I respect that, but I can't pretend this doesn't hurt. You meant so much to me and letting go isn't easy. I hope in time you'll find happiness, whatever that looks like for you. Sabina. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. He'd ended it with her. For all his faults, all the ways he'd hurt me. He'd finally taken the step I'd been too afraid to demand. He'd chosen me. But instead of relief, I felt an overwhelming wave of anger and sadness. It wasn't enough. Ending things with her didn't erase the betrayal, didn't undo the lies and the heartbreak, didn't make me feel whole again. I closed the laptop with a shaky breath, wiping at my eyes as I leaned back in the chair. What did I want from him? From us? Every answer I thought I'd found felt like it slipped through my fingers the moment I reached for it. I didn't trust him, how could I? But letting him go felt like cutting away a piece of myself, a wound that would never truly heal. That evening Ryan found me in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book I hadn't been able to focus on. He paused in the doorway, hesitating as though unsure whether he was welcome. I glanced up at him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Can I sit?" he asked finally, his voice soft. I nodded, and he took the chair across from me, his hands resting on his knees as he leaned forward slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, but for once it didn't feel unbearable. It felt necessary, like we'd reached a point where avoiding the conversation was no longer an option. "I got an email from Sabina," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "She said you ended things." Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "I did. The day after Christmas. I told her it was over, that I couldn't keep lying to you, or to myself." "And why is that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Because you got caught? Because it was easier to walk away from her than to face what you've done to me." "No," he said firmly, his eyes meeting mine. "Because I love you, Emily. Because I realized I was about to lose the best thing that ever happened to me. And I couldn't live with that." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You've got a funny way of showing it, Ryan. Sneaking around behind my back, writing her love letters, planning trips together. None of that says I love you to me." He flinched at my words, but he didn't look away. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "I don't even expect you to believe me. But I'm telling you the truth, Emily. What I did was selfish and wrong, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But it doesn't change how I feel about you." I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. He looked earnest, his eyes filled with pain and something else, hope maybe. But the cracks in my trust were too deep, the wounds too fresh. I wanted to believe him, but I didn't know if I could. "I need more than words, Ryan," I said finally. "I need actions. I need time. And I need you to understand that this isn't something you can just fix with a grand gesture or a heartfelt apology. It's going to take a lot more than that." "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm ready to do whatever it takes. No matter how long it takes." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over me. "We'll see," I said, my voice softer now. "For now, that's all I can give you." It wasn't a resolution, not really. But it was a start. A fragile, tentative step toward whatever came next. Whether that step would lead us back to each other or further apart, I didn't know. All I knew was that I was no longer standing still, trapped in the pain of what had been. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. The days stretched into weeks, and the rhythm of life in the house took on a strange, uneasy balance. Ryan stayed true to his word. He gave me space, kept his distance when I needed it, and didn't push for more than I was willing to give. He spent most of his time in the study or outside shoveling snow, finding small ways to make himself useful around the house without intruding. It was as if he was trying to prove himself in silence, letting his actions speak for him where his words had failed. I, on the other hand, threw myself into work. The deadlines and endless emails were a welcome distraction, a way to focus on something other than the gaping wound in my chest. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories always crept in during the quiet moments, when I lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, or when I passed by the living room and caught a glimpse of the couch where we used to curl up together. The weight of what had happened lingered, always just beneath the surface, threatening to drag me under if I let my guard down. One particularly cold evening, as the wind howled outside and snowflakes swirled against the windows, I found myself in the kitchen, pulling together a simple dinner. It was nothing fancy, just soup and sandwiches, but the act of cooking felt grounding, like a small step toward reclaiming some semblance of normalcy. Ryan appeared in the doorway as I was ladling soup into bowls, his expression cautious. "Smells good," he said, his voice hesitant. I glanced at him, nodding slightly. "There's enough for two," I said, surprising myself with the offer. He blinked as though he hadn't expected me to include him, but he recovered quickly. "Thank you," he said softly, stepping into the room. We ate in the dining room, the silence between us heavy but not unbearable. I couldn't remember the last time we'd shared a meal together, and though it was far from the easy companionship we once had, it felt like a step forward, or at least a pause in the downward spiral. Ryan didn't try to force conversation, and for that I was grateful. I wasn't ready for small talk, for pretending everything was fine. Instead, we sat together in the quiet, the clinking of spoons against bowls the only sound. After dinner, Ryan offered to do the dishes, and I didn't protest. I retreated to the living room, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a book I wasn't really reading. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a faint sense of peace. Not happiness, not even contentment, but a brief respite from the storm inside me. When Ryan joined me a little while later, he sat in the armchair across from me, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid of startling me. He didn't say anything, just sat there with a book of his own, the silence between us companionable in its own way. I stole a glance at him over the edge of my book, studying his profile in the firelight. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered, his eyes shadowed with regret. And for the first time I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, if he noticed the changes in me the way I noticed them in him. The thought lingered as the night wore on, and when I finally climbed the stairs to the guest room, I found myself turning it over in my mind. Ryan's remorse seemed genuine, and his efforts to respect my boundaries were more than I'd expected. But could I trust him? Could I ever look at him the same way again without seeing the shadow of his betrayal? I didn't have the answers, and that uncertainty weighed on me as I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. It was a small gesture, but it made me pause as I got out of bed and padded toward the kitchen. Ryan was standing at the counter, his back to me, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. He turned as I entered, offering me a tentative smile. "Morning," he said, sliding one of the mugs toward me. "Morning," I replied, my voice still rough with sleep. I took the mug, wrapping my hands around its warmth, and leaned against the counter. For a moment we stood there in silence, the early light filtering through the curtains and casting a soft glow over the room. "I was thinking," Ryan began hesitantly, breaking the quiet. "I know things are complicated right now, but I thought maybe we could do something together this weekend. Something small. Just get out of the house for a bit." I frowned slightly, caught off guard by the suggestion. "Like what?" "There's a park not far from here," he said. "They have a walking trail through the woods, and it's supposed to be beautiful this time of year. I thought maybe a walk might be nice. No pressure, just a change of scenery." I considered his words, the idea of a walk through snowy woods strangely appealing. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step towards something, connection maybe, or at least an attempt at rebuilding the fragile threads between us. "Okay," I said finally. "That sounds nice." Ryan's expression softened with relief, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Great," he said. "I'll pack us a thermos of hot chocolate." The weekend arrived and we bundled up in our warmest coats, scarves and gloves before heading to the park. The trail wound through a forest of towering pines, their branches heavy with snow, and the air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of evergreen. We walked in silence for a while, our boots crunching softly against the packed snow, and though the quiet between us was still tinged with tension, it felt less oppressive out here, surrounded by the calm of nature. Ryan handed me the thermos halfway through the walk, and we paused on a bench overlooking a frozen lake to share the hot chocolate. The warmth seeped through the cup into my hands, and I found myself relaxing, if only slightly, as I watched the sunlight glint off the ice. "Thank you for coming," Ryan said quietly, his voice barely louder than the wind rustling through the trees. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but it means a lot." I didn't respond right away, my gaze fixed on the lake. "It's a start," I said finally, my voice soft but honest. And for now that was enough. The walk through the snowy woods stayed with me long after we returned home, lingering like the fading warmth of the hot chocolate in my hands. It was a small thing, that quiet time together, but it felt like a step forward, or at least a moment of stillness in the chaos. Ryan hadn't pushed, hadn't tried to fill the silence with apologies or explanations. He'd just been there, steady and patient, letting me set the pace. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel suffocated by his presence. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the day in my mind. The way the snow had sparkled in the sunlight, the soft crunch of our boots on the trail, the way Ryan had offered me the thermos with a quiet smile. It was almost enough to make me forget. Almost. But the weight of his betrayal was still there. Like a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin, small but impossible to ignore. The next morning I found him in the kitchen again, making breakfast. Pancakes this time, the scent of maple syrup filling the air. He glanced up when I entered, offering me a hesitant smile. "Good morning," he said, flipping a pancake onto a plate. "I made enough for both of us if you're hungry." I nodded, sitting at the table as he brought over a stack of pancakes and a steaming pot of coffee. He moved with a quiet efficiency, setting everything in its place before sitting across from me. For a while we ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against plates and the soft hum of the coffee maker. It was strange, this fragile peace between us, like walking on thin ice. One wrong move and it could all shatter. "I've been thinking," Ryan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. He set his fork down, his gaze meeting mine. "About what you said. About needing more than words." I looked at him, unsure of where this was going. And I've started seeing someone," he said, his voice steady but nervous. "A therapist. I've only had a couple of sessions, but I think it's helping. I know I have a lot to work through, things I should have dealt with a long time ago, and I want to keep going, for myself but also for you. For us." The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I'd never suggested therapy, had never even considered it, but the fact that he'd taken that step on his own felt significant. It wasn't the kind of grand gesture he might have made before, the kind designed to sweep everything under the rug and move on. It was quiet, deliberate, and above all, honest. "I think that's a good idea," I said finally, my voice soft. "It's a start." Ryan nodded, relief flashing across his face. "I'm not expecting it to fix everything overnight," he said. "But I want to understand why I did what I did. And I want to make sure I never put you, or myself, in this position again." I studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all I saw was a man trying to piece himself back together, one shard at a time. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt, but it was a step in the right direction. Over the next few weeks, Ryan kept his promise. He went to therapy twice a week, leaving the house with a quiet determination and returning with a calmness I hadn't seen in him before. He didn't push me to talk about what I was feeling, didn't ask for more than I was willing to give. Instead, he focused on the small things, the day-to-day moments that made up our lives. He cooked dinner most nights, shoveled the driveway after every snowfall, and even started fixing the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, a task he'd been putting off for months. I noticed the changes, though I didn't always know what to make of them. Part of me was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to revert to the man who had lied to me so easily. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the love we'd shared, found itself softening just a little. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Ryan came in with a mug of tea. He set it down on the coffee table and sat across from me, his hands clasped in his lap. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice careful. I nodded, my fingers stilling on the sweater I was folding. "What is it?" "Have you thought about us?" he asked. "About what you want. I know it's still early and I don't want to rush you, but I need to know where your head is." I set the sweater aside, taking a deep breath. The truth was, I thought about us constantly. About what we'd been, what we were now, and what we might become. But every time I tried to picture the future, it felt like staring into a fog, the path ahead unclear. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Some days I think I can forgive you. Other days I don't. It's like, part of me wants to move forward, but another part is still stuck in the past, replaying everything over and over." Ryan nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "I get it," he said. I wish I could take it all back, Emily. I wish I could undo everything and give you the life you deserve. But all I can do now is keep trying. Keep proving to you that I'm worth a second chance. I looked at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. It's not just about proving it to me, I said quietly. You need to prove it to yourself. You need to figure out who you are, Ryan. What you want and why you made the choices you did. Because until you do, I don't think we can move forward. He nodded again, his jaw tightening. I will, he said. I promise you I will. The conversation left me feeling both lighter and heavier, as though we'd taken a step closer to something real. But the weight of what lay ahead still loomed large. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could find our way back to each other. But I also knew that forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that neither of us could rush. For now, all I could do was take it one day at a time, trusting that the answers I needed would come when I was ready to face them. And as I sipped the tea Ryan had made me, its warmth spreading through my chest, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. That maybe, just maybe, the pieces of my broken heart could one day be made whole again. The weeks turned into months, each one a slow, deliberate march forward. Winter melted into early spring, and with it came subtle changes, both in the world around us and in the fragile dynamic that had taken root between Ryan and me. The snow that had blanketed our yard gave way to patches of green, the first brave shoots of crocuses poking through the thawing ground. I found myself drawn to the garden, spending hours digging, planting and weeding. There was something cathartic about working with the soil, about creating life in a space that had been dormant for so long. Ryan, to his credit, gave me my space but didn't hover far. He'd often join me outside, tackling repairs around the house, or simply sitting on the porch with a book while I worked. He didn't try to force conversation, but I noticed how his presence shifted, less tense, less filled with that nervous energy that had defined him in the immediate aftermath of everything. He seemed calmer, steadier, as though the therapy he'd committed to was beginning to shape him into someone new, or maybe someone closer to the man I thought I'd married. It wasn't until mid-April, when the first real warmth of the season arrived, that I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't before. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set over the trees, when Ryan spoke. I've been meaning to ask, he said, his voice hesitant. Do you remember when we planted that dogwood tree in the backyard? The one by the fence? I nodded, glancing at the tree in question. It was taller now, its branches tipped with delicate buds that promised flowers in the coming weeks. Of course, I said. It was our first spring in this house. Ryan smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the tree. I think about that day a lot. How we didn't know what we were doing, but we figured it out together. I could hear the unspoken meaning behind his words, the parallel he was drawing between that tree and us. For a moment, I didn't respond, my fingers tracing the edge of my mug. It's still standing, I said finally. That counts for something. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It does, but it wouldn't be if we hadn't taken care of it. The weight of his words settled over me, and I found myself looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time in weeks. His face was familiar and yet somehow changed, older, maybe, or just marked by the events of the past months. He met my gaze, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. I'm not saying it's the same, he said quietly. I know what I did wasn't just a storm that blew through. It was more than that. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to tend to us. If you are. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, and I had to look away, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Ryan, I began, my voice trembling. I want to believe you. I really do. But I'm scared. Scared that if I let myself trust you again, I'll end up back in the same place. I understand, he said softly, and I can't promise I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I'll never stop trying to be better, for you, for us, and for me. I didn't respond right away, the words caught in my throat. But as I looked out at the yard, at the tree we'd planted all those years ago, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a glimmer of hope, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. Let's start small, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. One day at a time. Ryan nodded, his relief palpable. One day at a time, he repeated. That's all I'm asking. From that day forward, things began to change, slowly but steadily. We started spending more time together. Not because we felt obligated, but because it felt right. We took walks in the evenings, our conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to deeper, more honest discussions about the cracks in our relationship and how we might repair them. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing my fears and frustrations, my hopes and doubts. And Ryan listened, really listened, without interrupting or trying to defend himself. It was a small thing, but it mattered. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch again, Ryan handed me a small envelope. I frowned, glancing at him before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, the words neat and carefully chosen. Emily, I don't know if I'll ever be able to say everything I want to say to you, so I thought I'd write it instead. You deserve more than my words, but this is my way of trying to put into writing what's in my heart. I hurt you. I broke your trust, and I'll never stop regretting that. But I want you to know that every day, I'm working to be a better man. Not just for you but for myself. I'm learning things about myself I didn't have the courage to face before, and it's hard. But it's worth it. I love you, Emily. I always have. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much. Ryan. I read the letter twice, my heart aching at the sincerity of his words. When I finally looked up, Ryan was watching me, his expression cautious. I meant every word, he said softly. I know, I replied, folding the letter carefully and tucking it back into the envelope. And I think I'm ready to take another step. The words surprised even me, but as I said them, I felt a weight lift from my chest. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe that was enough. That night, I sat with Ryan's letter in my hands long after he'd gone upstairs. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, and the house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. His words played over and over in my mind, their sincerity wrapping around me like a fragile promise. I didn't know if I could fully believe him yet, but there was something different this time. Something steady. He wasn't rushing me, wasn't pushing for forgiveness, or trying to force a resolution. Instead, he was giving me time. And perhaps more importantly, he was giving himself time to change. I carried the letter upstairs, setting it on my nightstand before climbing into bed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I thought about all the moments that had brought us here, the good ones and the bad. I thought about the life we'd built together, the memories we'd shared, and the cracks that had formed long before either of us had noticed. I thought about Sabina, about the pain her existence had caused me, and the questions that still lingered in my mind. But most of all, I thought about what I wanted, what I truly wanted, beyond the hurt and the anger. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside my window, a reminder that spring was fully upon us. The air felt lighter, as though the world itself was exhaling after the long, heavy winter. I dressed quickly, pulling on a sweater and jeans, and made my way downstairs. Ryan was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. I poured myself some coffee and leaned against the counter, watching him carefully. He looked different these days, quieter, more thoughtful. The nervous energy that had once defined him had been replaced by a calmness I wasn't sure I fully understood. "I was thinking," I began, my voice tentative. "Maybe we could spend some time together today. Go somewhere. Just the two of us." Ryan's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he quickly nodded. "I'd like that," he said. "Where do you want to go?" I hesitated, considering the question. "Maybe the park again. The one with the walking trails." "Perfect," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'll pack us a picnic." A couple of hours later, we were walking side by side down a familiar trail, the sunlight filtering through the budding trees and casting dappled shadows on the ground. Ryan carried a small backpack with sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of lemonade, and I carried the blanket we planned to spread out by the lake. The air was warm and smelled of earth and new growth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of something resembling peace. We found a quiet spot by the water, the lake's surface shimmering like glass in the afternoon light. Ryan spread out the blanket while I unpacked the food, and soon we were sitting side by side, the sounds of nature filling the comfortable silence between us. He didn't say much and neither did I, but there was something healing about being there together, about sharing a moment that didn't feel weighted down by the past. As we ate, Ryan glanced at me, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course," I replied, though my heart fluttered at the uncertainty in his voice. "Do you ever think about what we could have done differently?" he asked. "Not just me, though God knows I made my share of mistakes, but us, as a couple." The question caught me off guard, but I appreciated his honesty. I took a moment to gather my thoughts before answering. "I think about it all the time," I admitted. "I think about how we let things slip, how we stopped talking about the important stuff and started focusing on the day-to-day. I think about how we got so comfortable that we didn't notice the cracks until they turned into fractures." Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the lake. "I think about that too," he said. "I think about how I didn't see it, or maybe I didn't want to see it. How I let my own insecurities and fears take over instead of facing them with you." I studied him for a moment, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "You never talked about your insecurities," I said softly. "Not really. I didn't know how," he admitted. "I think part of me was scared that if I said them out loud they'd become real. And maybe I thought you'd see me differently." I reached for his hand without thinking, my fingers brushing against his. "You didn't have to hide from me," I said. "I would have listened. I would have tried to understand. I know that now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But back then I didn't. And I'm sorry, Emily, for all of it. For shutting you out, for betraying you, for not being the partner you deserved." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said quietly. "Not completely. Not yet. But I want to try. I want to see if we can build something new." Ryan's hand tightened around mine, his eyes shining with gratitude. "That's all I've ever wanted," he said. "A chance to start over. To do it right this time." We sat there by the lake for hours talking about everything and nothing, the walls between us slowly coming down. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but it felt real. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I felt the smallest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Not as we were, but as something new, something stronger, something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were tentative, filled with small steps forward and the occasional stumble back. Ryan continued his therapy sessions and I began seeing a counselor of my own. For the first time, I had a space to unravel my own feelings without the weight of his expectations pressing down on me. I spoke about the betrayal, the anger, the fear of trusting him again. But I also spoke about the love we had shared, the reasons I hadn't been able to let go entirely. Those sessions became a lifeline, helping me see the situation with clearer eyes, without the haze of raw emotion clouding my judgment. Ryan and I established new routines, ones that prioritized communication and honesty. We scheduled weekly check-ins, time set aside to talk openly about how we were feeling and what we needed from each other. Some of those conversations were hard, brutal even, but they were necessary. For the first time in a long time, we weren't brushing things under the rug or pretending everything was fine. We were facing the mess head-on together. One evening in late spring, as the world outside was blooming with life, Ryan and I sat on the back porch watching the fireflies dance in the dusk. He held a mug of tea, and I had a glass of wine, the silence between us comfortable and warm. It had been months since the day I found that letter, and though the memory of it still lingered, it no longer felt like a fresh wound. It was a scar, visible, yes, but healing. Ryan turned to me, his expression serious but calm. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded, curious. "What is it?" "Do you think we've turned a corner?" he asked. "That we're finally okay?" I took a deep breath, considering his question. "I think we're getting there," I said honestly. "We've come a long way, Ryan. But I also think okay isn't a finish line. It's something we're going to have to work at every day." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I can live with that," he said. "As long as you're by my side." I smiled faintly, the weight of his words settling over me. I think I am, I said. For now at least. And that's more than I could have said a few months ago. Ryan reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. I know I don't deserve a second chance, he said quietly. But I promise you, Emily, I'm not going to waste it. For the first time I believed him. It wasn't just the words. It was everything he'd done since the moment I found that letter. The therapy, the honesty, the patience he'd shown in giving me the space I needed to heal. He had changed, and though I still wasn't sure what the future held for us, I was willing to take that leap of faith. We sat there together as the sky darkened, the fireflies glowing brighter against the deepening night. And as I leaned my head against Ryan's shoulder, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But maybe that was okay. Maybe perfection wasn't what we needed. Maybe all we needed was the willingness to keep trying one day at a time. And for the first time I thought we might just make it.